Imagine this: you are lying on the operating table, blinding surgical lights shining above you. Doctors in masks move with precision, almost like in a ritual. The anesthesiologist calmly asks you to count backward, 10, 9, 8, and suddenly, nothing. Time seems to stop. But when you open your eyes, you hear the joyful voices of the medical team: the surgery was a success. Yet inside, a terrifying feeling lingers: you were fully conscious the entire time. You heard conversations, the clinking of metal instruments, felt touches, but were completely paralyzed. You couldn't scream, you couldn't move. This is not a nightmare of fiction, but a reality known as intraoperative awareness, or awareness during anesthesia. Medical statistics on this phenomenon remain unclear. Anesthesiologists claim it occurs in roughly 1 patient out of 1,000, yet studies and eyewitness accounts suggest it happens far more often. One of the most famous cases is that of Canadian Donna Penner. During a routine surgery, she remained conscious for nearly 2 hours. She heard the doctors discussing the procedure and even joking among themselves, felt every cut of the scalpel, yet her body remained motionless, as if locked inside its own shell. After the operation, she was repeatedly told that it was all a figment of her imagination, until she learned of thousands of people worldwide with similar experiences. To understand how this is even possible, doctors attempt to explore the very nature of consciousness. Here, science encounters a mystery. No neuroscientist has yet been able to pinpoint where exactly in the brain the sense of self arises. And until a definitive answer is found, the risk of such cases repeating remains. Now let's travel back to the 19th century, when the words painless surgery sounded like a cruel joke. Surgery of that era resembled torture more than medicine. Operating rooms were simple spaces, wooden tables, sawdust on the floor to absorb blood, and the constant screams of patients. People were strapped down with leather belts, a wooden gag was placed in their mouths, and several attendants were required just to restrain the patient. Surgeons worked at lightning speed. An experienced doctor could amputate a limb in 2 to 3 minutes or remove a bladder stone in just 1. But speed didn't always save lives. More than half of patients died, either immediately on the table from shock or later from infections and complications. Attempts to ease suffering were desperate. Patients were given alcohol to induce unconsciousness, but the spirit often hindered more than it helped. Sometimes doctors compressed the carotid arteries hoping to cause fainting. More often than not, this ended in death. Ice was applied to numb limbs before surgery, but the effect was weak. Since ancient times, physicians knew about the properties of mandrake and opium, yet the precise dosage remained a mystery. Too little had no effect, while slightly more could be lethal. Doctors in the 19th century viewed pain very differently than we do today. Many genuinely believed it was a natural part of treatment. Suffering seemed to strengthen the body, and the loud cries of a patient were taken as proof that they were still alive. Some surgeons deliberately trained themselves not to respond to pleas for help, as it had become routine for them. One of the most famous surgeons of the time was Robert Liston, a legend of British medicine. He was called the fastest knife in London. But along with fame came tragic incidents. One operation entered history when Liston, hurrying to amputate a limb, accidentally cut his assistant's fingers. The outcome was horrifying. Both the patient and the assistant died of blood poisoning, and one observing student died of shock during the procedure. This operation became known in textbooks as the only one in history with 100% mortality. Yet patients still agreed to risky surgeries. Why? Because the alternative seemed even worse: gangrene, purulent infections, cancerous tumors. To die quickly under a surgeon's knife seemed more humane than to slowly rot alive. But the doctors themselves suffered no less. Witnessing this daily torment, many either turned to alcohol or lost their sanity. It's no wonder the profession of surgeon was considered cursed. They were feared almost as much as executioners. Against this grim backdrop emerged a man who changed everything. He was neither a great scientist nor a renowned doctor. He was an ordinary adventurous dentist, William Thomas Green Morton. A young man of 27, burdened with debts across Boston and failed ventures in dental prosthetics. He could be called the first medical startup founder, constantly inventing, experimenting with new ideas, seeking external funding, yet more often than not ending in failure. His dental practice was struggling as well. Morton's reputation was questionable, and tooth extractions were unbearably painful for patients, as he lacked the speed surgeons prided themselves on. But Morton was observant. He noticed that some doctors used various tricks to reduce pain, such as having patients inhale ammonia or aromatic oils. One day, he attended a lecture by the well-known American chemist Charles Thomas Jackson, who spoke about sulfuric ether, a clear liquid with a slightly sweet smell, usually used as a solvent. The lecturer noted that ether vapors could induce euphoria, dizziness, and even unconsciousness, and students often inhaled it for fun. In the 19th century, it was something like laughing gas parties. This detail captured Morton's attention. He thought, what if this effect could be used to relieve pain? Jackson warned him, you must be extremely careful with the dosage. A little too much, and the patient could die. But Morton, desperate and ambitious, became fascinated with the idea. His first test subject was himself. He soaked a cloth with ether, held it to his face, and soon fell unconscious. He woke up half an hour later with a headache, but alive. Next was his dog. Morton anesthetized the animal with ether vapors and confirmed it did not respond even to strong stimuli. The dog slept safely for several hours and awoke without any consequences. After this, Morton decided to move on to human experiments. And here he acted in a way that modern medicine would consider completely unethical. He began secretly administering ether to his patients, without informing them. The first person on whom William Morton dared to use ether was a teenager named Eben Frost. The boy had a painful tooth that needed extraction. On September 30, 1846, Morton proposed performing the procedure, in a new way, which, he claimed, would be painless, and even offered it for free. He soaked a cloth with ether, had Frost take a few inhalations, and the boy immediately lost consciousness. The dentist calmly removed the tooth, and when the patient came to, he was amazed to report that he remembered nothing and felt no pain. The experiment was a success. But Morton knew that one episode was not enough. To prove the effectiveness of his method, he needed more practice. This is where the story takes a darker turn. Morton thought not as a researcher, but as an entrepreneur. His goal was not only to make history but also to get rich. He decided to conceal the true composition of his substance. To do this, he added aromatic oils to the ether, altering its smell, and gave the mixture the mysterious name Letheon, from the Greek lethe, forgetfulness. He then filed for a patent, hoping to gain exclusive rights to anesthesia. Essentially, he dreamed of monopolizing human relief from pain. Any surgeon wishing to operate without suffering would have to pay him royalties. However, registering a patent required serious proof. Dental procedures alone were not enough, a dramatic public demonstration was needed. Morton turned to Boston's greatest surgeon, Dr. John Collins Warren, head of Massachusetts General Hospital and a figure of immense authority in the medical community. When the little-known dentist told Warren about his miraculous substance, the surgeon merely smirked at first. He had seen dozens of such revolutionaries, all of whom turned out to be charlatans. Yet Morton's persistence and the testimony of a few patients eventually piqued Warren's interest. Warren agreed, but with a strict condition: if Morton was confident in his Letheon, he had to demonstrate it not in a quiet office, but in the surgical amphitheater of Massachusetts General Hospital, before students of Harvard Medical School and his fellow doctors. It was a trial by fire, either triumph or nationwide disgrace. Morton accepted the challenge. The date was set for October 16, 1846, a day later called the Ether Revolution. Before this event, Morton continued his experiments in secret, away from the medical community. He used Letheon in his daily practice, without explaining to patients what exactly he was doing. People thought they were being offered an enhanced remedy based on alcohol or opium. Modern physicians would be horrified by such behavior. In the 21st century, informed consent is mandatory. The patient must know all risks and alternatives. But in the mid-19th century, things were different. The word of the doctor was unquestioned, and patients fully trusted his decisions. Even then, Morton's methods seemed dubious, as he hid the composition of the substance even from colleagues. The most ironic part of this story is that ether was not a secret at all. Its properties had been known to chemists since the 18th century. Moreover, Morton was not the first to use it in medicine. In 1842, American physician Crawford Long of Georgia performed several successful operations with ether, but being a modest provincial doctor, he did not publicize his successes or publish the results. Morton's mentor, dentist Horace Wells, experimented with nitrous oxide, known as laughing gas. In some cases it worked perfectly, but when Wells tried to present the method at Massachusetts General Hospital, the demonstration failed. The patient awoke during the procedure and screamed in pain. Wells was booed and expelled. Thus, on the stage remained only Morton, who dared to go all in. Dr. Charles Jackson, the chemistry professor who had once told Morton about ether, later claimed that he was the true originator of the idea of anesthesia. According to him, Morton had merely claimed someone else's idea as his own. Similar claims were made by other contemporaries, but all of these people shared one common problem: they lacked persistence, entrepreneurial spirit, and the ability to work with the public. They could be talented scientists, but they had no understanding that without wide publicity and public recognition, their discoveries would remain mere notes in laboratory journals. Morton, however, had a different temperament. He was a natural showman, a man who understood the power of spectacle. He realized that a single, local demonstration would achieve nothing. He needed to create an event that would go down in history. So he coordinated with reporters, secured newspaper attention, and sent invitations to the most influential doctors and professors in Boston. To deliver the ether vapors, he prepared a striking glass inhaler, far more impressive than the simple handkerchief used by other experimenters. The morning of October 16, 1846, arrived. Morton woke with a heavy sense of foreboding. This day would either bring him fame or destroy his career entirely. The surgical amphitheater of Massachusetts General Hospital was filled with the city's medical elite, professors, students, and surgeons. Many came out of curiosity. At the time, adventurers promising miracles often appeared. Skepticism hung thick in the air, dense as carbolic acid fumes. The patient was 20-year-old printer Gilbert Abbott. He had a benign but painful and disfiguring vascular tumor on his neck. The young man understood that the operation would be excruciating, but he agreed to the risk for the sake of free treatment. The procedure was to be led by the respected surgeon John Collins Warren, an experienced elder who approached the venture with extreme caution. He had already seen too many impostors and did not believe in miracles. The amphitheater, modeled after ancient theaters, was a circular room with tiered seating where students could observe every movement of the surgeon. There was no sterility. Doctors worked in ordinary clothing, sometimes wearing aprons that were washed only occasionally. When Abbott was laid on the table, he was pale and clearly frightened. And Morton was late. Fate, it seemed, had decided to test him at the most crucial moment. What actually happened is unknown. Did his carriage break down? Was he delayed by the morning fog, or was he simply flustered? History only records one fact. Warren, after waiting a few minutes, shrugged and was ready to begin the operation in the usual way. "Gentlemen, since our inventor does not see fit to appear, we shall proceed as usual," said the surgeon, and the students prepared to witness yet another painful procedure. Abbott heard these words and, in despair, tried to rise from the operating table. He understood what awaited him. But at that moment, Morton literally burst into the room, out of breath, holding the gleaming glass inhaler. "Forgive my delay, Dr. Warren. I am ready to begin the demonstration," he shouted. Some of the attending doctors were already preparing to leave, thinking the presentation would not take place. Warren hesitated. On one hand, Morton appeared frivolous, on the other, curiosity was piqued. "Very well," the surgeon finally said. "But you have only one chance. If your method fails, we will proceed in the usual manner." Morton nodded and approached Abbott. The young man looked at him with a mixture of terror and hope. At that moment, all of medical history seemed to hold its breath. In the mid-19th century, people's understanding of how anesthesia worked was extremely vague. To many observers, it seemed akin to magic or even witchcraft. "Breathe deeply and calmly," Morton whispered, holding the glass inhaler with a tube to the patient's face. Ether vapors entered Abbott's lungs, and soon his eyes closed, his breathing became steady, and his body relaxed. An artificial sleep had begun. Morton gave a signal to Dr. Warren. Absolute silence fell over the operating room. Over 100 people held their breath, eager to see whether the man before them was an innovator or just another charlatan. The surgeon picked up the scalpel and made the first incision. Normally, patients would scream and convulse at this point, but Abbott remained perfectly still. As the incision deepened and the tumor was separated from healthy tissue, the patient still showed no sign of pain. The operation lasted about 25 minutes. A near eternity for the time, as surgeons usually worked as quickly as possible to minimize the patient's suffering. But now they could proceed slowly, methodically, and carefully. When the work was complete, Dr. Warren sutured the wound and set aside his instruments. Morton removed the inhaler. A few minutes later, Gilbert Abbott awoke, touched the bandage, and asked in surprise, "Have you already started?" The amphitheater erupted in applause. Students shouted, "Bravo," and doctors excitedly discussed what they had witnessed. Warren, who had been skeptical, uttered a phrase that would go down in history: "Gentlemen, this is no trick." Those present realized they had witnessed the birth of a new era in surgery. Yet even at the moment of triumph, Morton did not reveal the true composition of his Letheon. He claimed it was a special mixture of components, the formula of which was a commercial secret. This irritated his colleagues. On one hand, they saw that the remedy worked, but on the other, no self-respecting doctor wanted to use a substance with an unknown composition. Following this success, Morton became famous throughout America. His name appeared in newspapers, he was invited to medical conferences, and doctors from all over the country asked him to share the recipe for the new anesthetic. But Morton chose a different path. He filed for a patent and declared that any surgeon wishing to operate without pain would have to purchase a license from him. This move caused an uproar. The medical community believed that relieving human suffering could not be the subject of a monopoly. Dr. Warren felt betrayed. His reputation had helped Morton achieve fame, and now Morton sought to profit from the discovery. The investigation quickly revealed an unpleasant truth. Letheon was not a mysterious formula, but ordinary sulfuric ether, a substance known to chemists for decades. Morton's reputation suffered. He was accused of greed, avarice, and even fraud. The situation worsened when other claimants to the title of Father of Anesthesia emerged. First was Dr. Charles Jackson, the very chemistry professor who had once told Morton about ether. He insisted that he was the true originator of the idea, and Morton had merely stolen it. Jackson was respected in the scientific community and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He had evidence that he knew of ether's anesthetic properties long before Morton's demonstration. The second claimant was Horace Wells, Morton's former mentor. He asserted that he had been the first to use nitrous oxide for anesthesia, and that his student had simply replaced it with ether. The unfortunate Wells had once failed a public demonstration, which broke him. He lost his practice, fell into depression, and soon became a victim of alcoholism. Thus, the dawn of a new era in medicine quickly turned into a series of scandals, rivalries, and mutual accusations. When the scandal over the priority of the discovery erupted, another claimant entered the fray. Dr. Crawford Long from Georgia presented medical records proving that he had used ether for anesthesia 4 years before Morton's demonstration. Long was a provincial doctor, honest and modest, never seeking fame. But friends persuaded him to assert his rights. After all, he was the first to successfully perform surgery under ether anesthesia. Soon a fourth candidate appeared, dentist William Clark. He claimed that as early as 1842 he had used ether to relieve pain, but at the time he had not given it much importance. A true war over the invention had begun. Each claimant hired lawyers, collected testimonies, published pamphlets and articles to prove their case, often portraying their rivals as ridiculous or dishonorable. Newspapers eagerly reported the scandal, and medical journals featured it prominently on their front pages. Public opinion was divided into camps, each supporting its own true discoverer. Morton found himself at the center of the storm. He was accused of plagiarism, greed, and attempting to profit from someone else's discovery. Legal battles drained him financially, and his debts mounted. The irony was that while the four men fought for fame, thousands of patients around the world continued to suffer from pain. Many doctors refused to use ether anesthesia, unsure whom to pay royalties to and unwilling to get involved in the scandal. Anesthesia spread slowly and unevenly around the world. In some clinics it was actively used, in others, it was deliberately ignored. European doctors, in particular, were wary of the innovation. Both distrust of American medicine and fear of untested methods played a role. Religious authorities added fuel to the fire. Many preachers argued that pain was sent by God and that humans had no right to avoid it. This was especially emphasized in childbirth, citing the Bible's assertion that a woman must bear children in pain. A turning point came only in 1853, when Queen Victoria agreed to use chloroform during the birth of her 8th child. After that, anesthesia was no longer considered blasphemous. It became a symbol of progress and civilization. Yet the fates of the claimants themselves were tragic. Horace Wells could not bear the shame and disappointment. He became addicted to chloroform, used it for euphoria, became involved in scandalous incidents, and eventually ended up in prison. There, he wrote a farewell letter to his wife, then slit an artery and died inhaling chloroform, the very substance to which he had devoted his life. Charles Jackson suffered a mental breakdown. Court battles, constant accusations, and the need to defend his name drove him to paranoia. He imagined conspiracies everywhere and believed judges were bribed. In 1873, he was declared insane and confined to a psychiatric hospital. He spent his final years in complete madness, scrawling chemical formulas on walls and insisting that he was the true inventor of anesthesia. Crawford Long proved the wisest. He realized that fighting for priority harmed the progress of medicine and declined to pursue legal battles. Returning to his rural practice, he continued to treat patients quietly and without ambition. Only later did history acknowledge that Long was the first to use ether anesthesia in surgery. Thus, instead of a single hero, humanity ended up with four conflicting fates. Anesthesia triumphed, but its inventors paid an extraordinarily high price for that victory. The fate of William Thomas Morton proved to be the saddest of the four. The Patent Office never recognized his claim to the discovery of anesthesia, and courts repeatedly ruled against him. Legal expenses piled up, debts multiplied, and Morton's name in medical circles became almost synonymous with charlatan. He lost everything, first his dental practice, then his house and accumulated savings. His wife and children left him, and friends who had once admired his successes turned away. From a brilliant dentist, he became an outcast. The last years of his life were spent in poverty. Morton eked out a living with odd jobs and wrote endless petitions to Congress, trying to secure compensation from the government for his contribution to medicine. But all efforts were in vain. On July 15, 1868, during a walk in New York's Central Park, Morton died of a stroke. He was only 48. He was found sitting on a bench, a newspaper open in his hands. In it was yet another article accusing him of claiming someone else's discovery. Perhaps this was the final blow for the broken man. However, even the deaths of the main participants did not settle the dispute. The question of who was the true discoverer of anesthesia continued to be debated for decades. In 1909, the American Medical Association recognized Crawford Long as the first physician to successfully use ether in surgery. In 1922, the International Association of Surgeons confirmed this conclusion. Yet no single consensus exists. Some textbooks mention Long, others Morton, and still others Horace Wells. Each left his mark, but none became the sole hero of the discovery. The bitterest irony is that all these men fought for fame and recognition, yet overlooked the fundamental question: what exactly happens to human consciousness under anesthesia? To them, ether was merely a convenient tool, like a scalpel or clamp. They did not consider the nature of consciousness, how the brain perceives pain, or where a person's sense of self goes during an operation. Scientists only began exploring these questions much later, and it turned out that understanding them is far more difficult than discovering anesthesia itself. More than 150 years have passed since the first demonstration. Medicine has advanced extraordinarily: organ transplants, cancer treatments, genetic engineering. Yet no one can fully explain what happens to human consciousness under anesthesia. Modern anesthetics are far more complex. Today, doctors use dozens of drugs. Some switch off consciousness, others suppress pain, and still others relax muscles. Anesthesiologists monitor virtually every vital function of the patient. Yet despite this precision, the mechanism remains mysterious. It is known that these drugs act on neurons. They disrupt signal transmission, block certain channels, or alter receptor function. However, scientists do not fully understand how these processes result in loss of consciousness. Moreover, different substances achieve the same effect by completely different pathways. This is similar to a light bulb. It can be turned off by unplugging it, cutting the power, or a burnt-out filament. The result is darkness, but the mechanisms are different. From this arises the idea that consciousness is not a single brain function, but the product of a complex interaction of multiple systems. Disrupt any one of the critical components, and everything collapses. But here arises an even more fascinating question: where exactly does consciousness reside? Is it possible to point to a specific part of the brain and say, here is the self? For a long time, scientists hoped to find such a center, a special area responsible for self-awareness. However, modern neuroscience has shown that no single center exists. Consciousness is more like a symphony orchestra, where dozens of different regions of the brain work in unison, creating a coherent melody of perception. If you turn off one group of instruments, the harmony is disrupted. And if the conductor loses control, chaos ensues. This is exactly how anesthetics work. They break the connections between brain regions. Individual areas may continue to function, but the overall picture is gone. For this reason, partial awakening sometimes occur during operations. A patient may hear the voices of doctors, feel pain, but be unable to move. Consciousness flickers like a faulty light bulb. It turns on and off. The story of Donna Penner, which we discussed earlier, illustrates this perfectly. Her hearing and pain receptors functioned normally, but her motor functions were blocked. It turns out that under anesthesia, a person does not disappear completely. Consciousness fragments, individual rooms, continue to operate, but the connections between them are lost. There are even more mysterious cases. Some patients report vivid dreams or even out-of-body experiences after awakening. They described floating above the operating table, encountering deceased relatives, or entering other worlds. Skeptics attribute this to the effects of anesthetics on the temporal lobes, where memories and fantasies are formed. However, there is evidence that puzzles science. Patients accurately recalled surgeons' conversations and described instruments and details of the procedure that they could not have known. Could consciousness exist independently of the body? This question remains open to this day. And here we come to the most famous story, the case of Pam Reynolds. In 1991, she was diagnosed with a brain aneurysm, a tiny bulge in an artery wall, no bigger than a pea. But this time bomb could have caused instant death at any moment. Traditional surgery was impossible. The aneurysm's location made access extremely risky. Doctors then proposed a desperate method: hypothermic circulatory arrest. The idea was to bring the patient into a state of clinical death. Her body was cooled to 15 degrees Celsius, the heart was stopped, and blood was completely drained from the brain. Only in this way did the surgeons gain a short window, about half an hour, to remove the aneurysm and attempt to revive her. To monitor the depth of anesthesia, Pam was connected to multiple sensors. Special lenses were placed in her eyes that clicked and tested brainstem responses. Headphones with loud sound signals were inserted in her ears to record auditory reflexes. When the equipment showed a complete absence of reactions, the surgeons began the operation. And it was at that very moment that something incredible happened. Pam woke up. Physically, Pam's body remained completely motionless, her muscles were relaxed, and her reflexes were entirely suppressed. But the most astonishing thing was that her consciousness returned. Moreover, it returned in an unusual form. It seemed to rise above the operating table. She observed herself from the outside, saw the doctors leaning over her open skull, and heard the surgeon irritably remark that the arteries were narrower than the images had suggested. She remembered countless details that she could not have known by ordinary means. For example, the shape of the bone saw. The device resembled an electric toothbrush. She heard the song Hotel California by the Eagles playing in the operating room, and even overheard the surgeon talking with a nurse about problems with the catheters. All of this was recorded in her memory, even though her eyes were taped shut and her brain, according to the monitors, was in a state of complete inactivity. Then came the most dangerous moment of the surgery. Her heart was stopped, the blood was drained from her vessels, and her brain was deprived of oxygen and electrical activity. By all medical measures, Pam was considered dead. And it was at this moment that her consciousness moved into an entirely different experience. She saw a tunnel filled with light, met deceased relatives, her grandmother and uncle, who told her it was time to return. After 32 minutes, the surgeons completed the procedure, restarted her heart, and restored blood flow. Pam awoke. When she recounted her experiences to the doctors, they were astonished. Every detail she mentioned matched reality, from the music in the operating room to the exact words of the medical staff. But how is this possible? The brain was completely offline. The electroencephalogram showed a flat line, no neural impulses. Skeptics attempted to explain everything as hallucinations or memory processing, yet inconsistencies remained. For instance, Pam could not have seen the shape of the saw before anesthesia, and her eyes had remained closed throughout the surgery. And this is not an isolated case. Hundreds of people worldwide report similar experiences during clinical death. In medicine, this is called a near-death experience, NDE. It is often explained as the activity of a dying brain, yet some cases defy conventional understanding. For example, in Seattle, a patient named Maria reported seeing a tennis shoe on the windowsill of the third floor during resuscitation. Later, a nurse indeed found the shoe exactly there, in a place impossible to view from her position. Another case involved a man named Sullivan, who underwent heart surgery. He described the surgeon during the procedure gesturing with his hands like a conductor. Later, nurses confirmed that this surgeon indeed had that habit when giving instructions. These stories raise a fundamental question: what is consciousness? Traditional science considers it a product of brain activity, the result of interactions among billions of neurons. There is ample evidence for this. Head injuries alter personality, Alzheimer's disease destroys memory, and anesthesia suppresses consciousness by affecting neurons. Yet anomalous cases remain. Neurologist John Lorber of the University of Sheffield studied patients with hydrocephalus. Some of them had skulls almost entirely filled with fluid, their brain tissue compressed to just a few millimeters. Logically, these individuals should have been incapable of normal life. Yet, contrary to expectations, many of them learned, worked, and raised families. One student with an IQ of 126 had only 1 millimeter of brain tissue. Lorber posed a provocative question: is the brain truly necessary for consciousness? His findings shocked his colleagues. There are other examples. After surgeries in which entire lobes of the brain were removed, patients retained the ability to think and communicate. Moreover, the brain possesses remarkable plasticity. If one area is damaged, another can take over its functions. For instance, in blind individuals, the visual cortex is repurposed for processing sound, and in deaf individuals, it becomes more active in visual perception. But then arises the mystery: where exactly is personality stored? Where are memory, imagination, and creative abilities located? Modern researchers search for the neural correlates of consciousness, patterns of activity corresponding to different states. It is known that under anesthesia, connectivity between brain regions sharply decreases, and perception falls apart. Yet even this does not explain the phenomenon of vivid consciousness during clinical death. Some physicists have gone further, suggesting that consciousness may have a quantum nature. Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff proposed the hypothesis that the brain functions as a quantum biocomputer, with neuronal microtubules sustaining quantum states. If this is true, consciousness is not limited to classical neuronal processes and may exist independently of them. Critics argue that the brain is too warm and noisy a system for quantum coherence. But recent research shows that quantum effects do occur in biological systems, for example, in photosynthesis, bird navigation, and enzyme activity. If consciousness is even partially quantum, anesthetics do not destroy it, they merely sever its connection to the body. In that case, personality and memory may persist in some kind of quantum field, while medicine has yet to learn how to detect it. It sounds like science fiction, but hypotheses like these are being seriously discussed today. 100 years ago, radio waves, X-rays, or nuclear energy seemed like incredible science fiction, yet today they are an everyday part of our lives. And if we allow that consciousness could truly exist independently of the brain, then death ceases to be an end, it becomes a transition. In this context, anesthesia is not merely a temporary shutdown but a kind of journey into another reality. Perhaps patients who claim they floated above the operating table are not imagining it, but are actually leaving their bodies. Maybe encounters with deceased relatives occur not in the imagination, but in some parallel dimension. Of course, these are only hypotheses, yet even modern science, adhering to a materialistic view, cannot explain all phenomena related to consciousness. We know far less about it than we usually think. Now imagine that every operation under anesthesia is an act of incredible trust. The patient essentially allows the doctor to temporarily kill their consciousness, only to restore it afterward. And the most astonishing part, we do this without understanding the mechanism. No one can guarantee that after waking, a person is exactly the same as before the surgery. Moreover, philosophers have debated for centuries what it truly means to remain the same person. Thought experiments only heighten the intrigue. If your brain were fully copied and transferred into a cloned body, which of the two would be the real you? Could each of them genuinely consider themselves authentic? What if such copying happens in miniature every time under anesthesia? You fall asleep as one person and wake as another, with memories as if it were a continuation of the previous self. Continuity of the self cannot be verified. Every night we lose consciousness in sleep, and in the morning, someone wakes up who only believes they are you. Anesthesia simply makes this paradox more apparent. There is another perspective. Perhaps consciousness is not a permanent entity but a process, a dynamic flow that is constantly changing, like a river whose waters are never the same. Then anesthesia is merely a temporary interruption of this flow. The brain preserves the structure, and upon awakening, reconstructs the personality once again. Yet, despite this uncertainty, millions of people trust doctors and lie down on the operating table without fear. Statistics support them. Modern anesthesia is incredibly safe. The The likelihood of severe complications is less than 1 in 100,000 surgeries, and the risk of waking during anesthesia has dropped to 1 in 30,000. This is immense progress compared to the 19th century, when patients could die from shock induced by pain. But the mystery of consciousness remains. Imagine a future where anesthetics not only block pain but can manipulate dream content, teach new skills during surgery, or even store backup copies of personality before a risky procedure. This opens the door to digital immortality. Already, artificial intelligence shows early signs of consciousness, and laboratories grow mini-brains from stem cells. Perhaps in decades, humanity will learn to transfer consciousness into new bodies or virtual worlds. With this, serious ethical questions arise. Is it permissible to destroy copies of consciousness? Will artificial intelligence have the right to personhood? Or, conversely, might consciousness be unique and non-replicable? In that case, death remains the end, and anesthesia, a temporary disappearance of the self. Which future feels closer to you, digital immortality or acceptance of mortality? Technology is advancing faster than we can fully grasp, and in a few generations, life will change beyond recognition. Yet one thing remains constant: every time an anesthesiologist asks you to count backward, you take a small journey into the unknown. This is one of humanity's oldest and most contemporary experiments, continuing for over a century and a half. And perhaps, within this mystery, lies a special kind of beauty. If you enjoyed our video, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. There's a lot of exciting content ahead.